They called her Yorktown, a city of steel and fire, born not in glory, but in silence, deep inside the shipyards of Newport News, Virginia. The year was 1936. The world was inching toward chaos, and America's answer to that storm was being welded together, plate by plate. She wasn't just a ship. She was a dream in motion. 800 feet of armor and ambition, built to carry the warplanes that would one day decide the fate of oceans. To her builders, she was CV-5. To her crew, she became something more. Home. When the men first stepped aboard her decks, she gleamed like a new sunrise. Polished brass, humming turbines, and the faint scent of oil mixed with salt air, the smell of promise. One young sailor wrote home in his diary, "They say she's the finest ship afloat. I don't know about that, but when I walk her decks, I feel like I'm part of something that'll outlast us all." The Yorktown began her early voyages, not in battle, but in training. The crew learned to move as one heartbeat. Pilots, deckhands, engineers, and signalmen, all bound to a single purpose, to master the floating kingdom that would one day fight for the Pacific. In 1940, the ocean still felt endless and quiet. America wasn't at war yet, but the men aboard Yorktown could feel it, the tension in the wind, the headlines whispered in the mess hall, the sense that history was holding its breath. They drilled endlessly. Mock alarms, simulated attacks, long nights of watch duty under 1,000 silent stars. Every man aboard learned a simple truth. In war, survival wasn't luck, it was preparation. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burned, and with it the illusion of peace. From that day forward, the Pacific was no longer a map, it was a battleground. While Yorktown lay thousands of miles away, her fate was sealed that morning. The same fleet that had been her pride became her brothers in arms, many of whom would never rise again. When the smoke cleared over Hawaii, Yorktown's orders came swiftly. She was to hunt, to strike back, to carry the first wave of American resolve into the endless blue. A pilot later recalled, "We were young, maybe too young. None of us really knew what we were heading into, but when we launched those first planes, there was no fear, only focus, only duty." In the first months of war, Yorktown became a ghost in motion, never still, always searching. Her decks trembled under the power of her air group. Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters tearing through the sky. They trained day and night, the horizon blurring into the unknown. They were no longer just sailors and pilots. They were the thin line between survival and surrender. One mechanic remembered, "When the engines roared, it felt like the ship was alive, breathing through steel and smoke. We didn't think of her as a machine anymore. She was one of us." In February 1942, Yorktown struck her first blow. The Marshall Islands, the Gilberts. Her aircraft rained destruction on enemy bases, swift, precise, unrelenting. The world took notice. America was fighting back. But every victory cast a shadow. The crew began to understand that every flight might be their last. For every bomb that fell, for every ship that burned, there were faces, Unseen enemies fighting for their own cause, their own survival. And amid the chaos, Yorktown became more than steel. She became a promise that freedom could endure even when the ocean itself seemed to burn. At night, her decks glowed under the moonlight. Men wrote letters by dim lanterns to wives, mothers, sweethearts they might never see again. Each word sealed with salt, sweat, and quiet courage. Tell Mary not to worry. The sea's rough, but so are we. They didn't know it yet, but their greatest test was coming. One that would decide not only the course of the war, but the survival of their ship itself. For somewhere beyond the horizon, a storm was rising, not of wind and rain, but of fire. In the months ahead, Yorktown would face the unthinkable, and though she would fall, she would not vanish. She would become something greater, a memory, a legend, the Ghost of Midway.
The first scent of war came on a humid morning in the South Pacific. The sea was calm, the horizon flat as glass, but every man aboard Yorktown could feel it. That trembling edge between peace and chaos, the kind that made a heartbeat louder than the engines. By April 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had begun to shift. The Japanese Empire was expanding swiftly, reaching south toward Australia. If they'd captured Port Moresby, the doorway to the southern seas would be theirs. The Americans would have no choice but to fight, and Yorktown would lead the strike. The Coral Sea was quiet that morning, almost too quiet. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that hid danger well. For days, reconnaissance planes from both sides circled above the horizon, each searching for a shadow of the other. It was like two predators moving in the dark, waiting for a flicker of movement before the kill. Aboard Yorktown, men slept in their flight suits. The tension was constant, an ache that settled deep in the bones. Letters were written and never sealed. Meals went untouched. Every order, every alarm could mean the next moment would be their last. On May 4th, they found their first target, Japanese ships off Tulagi. Yorktown's aircraft roared into the sky, their engines shattering the silence. Dauntless dive bombers peeled through the clouds, one after another, sunlight flashing off their wings. They struck fast, hard, and vanished into the horizon. For the first time, the men aboard Yorktown heard what victory sounded like. Not cheers, but relief. They had drawn blood. But the real battle was still to come. 3 days later, the Japanese fleet was sighted. Carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku escorting invasion forces south. Two Titans were now on a collision course in the open Pacific, and neither knew exactly where the other was. When the sun rose on May 8th, the sea was a mirror. Far beyond the visible line of blue, Japanese and American squadrons were already in the air, hunting each other. The air itself seemed to hum with fate. Then, contact. A Japanese dive bomber squadron found them. The sky darkened with dots growing larger by the second. Sirens wailed across the ship. Men scrambled to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life. The calm of the morning vanished in a thunder of fire. Bombs fell like lightning. The first struck near the stern, blasting open steel and flame. The ship lurched. Smoke swallowed the flight deck. But the men did not run. They moved with the kind of rhythm that only desperation can teach. They fought the fires, sealed the compartments, tended to the wounded. The deck crews kept launching planes through the smoke because Yorktown refused to fall silent. One of her gunners,
barely 20 years old, later wrote in a letter never sent, "I couldn't hear anything after the first blast, just the heartbeat in my head. The world went white with noise, and I thought, if this is it, at least I'm standing." Hours later, the Japanese fleet was in flames too. Lexington, Yorktown's sister carrier, had taken the worst of it. She burned bright against the sky, her decks a storm of black smoke. The order came to abandon her. Men leapt into the sea as Lexington exploded, her death lighting the horizon like a dying sun. Aboard Yorktown, silence hung heavy. They had won, technically. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was stopped. But it didn't feel like victory. The air still smelled of fuel and salt and loss. When Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor, she was scarred. Bomb holes, ruptured plates, and the twisted remains of gun mounts told the story of how close she had come to the same fate as Lexington. The engineers who inspected her said she'd need months of repair, but the war didn't have months. In late May 1942, intelligence from cryptographers at Station Hypo revealed a chilling truth. Japan was planning an attack on a tiny atoll called Midway. The Japanese fleet, 4 carriers strong, would strike within days. If they succeeded, Hawaii could fall next. There was no time. So the Navy made an impossible order: repair Yorktown in 72 hours. For 3 days and nights, the shipyard at Pearl Harbor became a storm of men, machines, and sparks. Welders worked without rest. Painters brushed fresh markings over scorched metal. Crews replaced engines, patched decks, and wired communications by hand. They slept in shifts of minutes, not hours. The men aboard watched in awe as their ship came alive again. Every hammer strike sounded like defiance. Every repaired panel was an act of hope. A mechanic said later, "We didn't just fix her, we resurrected her." On June 2, 1942, Yorktown sailed again, battered, bruised, but breathing. As she left the harbor, sailors on other ships saluted in silence. They knew what it meant to go out like that, still wounded, still burning inside, but unwilling to stop. The ocean stretched ahead endless and blue, as Yorktown and her crew prepared for what would become one of the greatest battles in human history. They didn't know if they would return. They only knew they had to go. The time for waiting was over. The storm of Midway had begun to rise. The Pacific looked calm that morning, but calm was only disguise. Beneath the horizon, forces were already in motion. Fleets steaming through open water, code breakers whispering over intercepted messages, pilots sleeping beside their planes, dreaming of home. The world did not yet know it, but the next few days would decide who ruled the ocean. At Pearl Harbor, men in cramped rooms stared at strings of numbers and fragments of words. Station Hypo, the small intelligence unit few had ever heard of, had done the impossible. They had cracked the Japanese naval code. From the tangle of ciphers came a name: AF. It was the target the enemy planned to strike. The analysts believed AF meant Midway Atoll, a speck of coral halfway between Hawaii and Japan. To be certain, they sent a simple ruse, a message from Midway claiming that its water distillation system had broken down. Days later, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF is short of water. The trap was sprung. Admiral Chester Nimitz made his decision. The Japanese would come to Midway expecting surprise. Instead, surprise would be waiting for them. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown would lie in wait northeast of the atoll. It was a plan built on nerve, 3 ships against 4, courage against power. When Yorktown left Pearl Harbor, her patched hull still bore the scars of Coral Sea. Men ran their hands across the new steel and said quiet prayers. Some didn't believe she would survive another battle. Others thought she had already become something unkillable. The welder's seams still gleamed like silver veins, pulsing with life. "She's held together by faith and paint," one sailor joked, though no one laughed for long. For days the carrier steamed through empty blue. The sea was wide and endless, the sky a hard, perfect dome. Beneath that beauty hid dread. The knowledge that somewhere out there another armada was coming, one larger, faster, heavier than their own. Pilots studied maps until the ink smudged their fingers. Mechanics checked engines twice, then again. Chaplains spoke softly in the ready rooms. The air itself felt electric, as if the ocean were holding its breath. June 3, 1942. Dawn broke over Midway with the quiet of inevitability. A lone scout plane spotted the Japanese invasion force. The enemy was coming. At last, the waiting was done. That night, on Yorktown, the crew wrote their last letters. Some folded them into pockets. Others burned them, afraid they might jinx the morning. A pilot named William Leonard later remembered the silence before battle. You could hear the sea against the hull, that slow breathing sound. No one spoke. We were all listening to it, as if the ocean already knew what was about to happen. June 4. At 04:30 hours, flight decks roared to life. Pilots strapped in, faces streaked with sweat and oil. The first light of day touched the wings of the waiting aircraft. When the signal came, they launched into the pale sky, the thunder of takeoff rolling across the waves like drums of destiny. The Japanese struck first. Bombs rained on Midway's airfields, plumes of smoke rising like black columns against the dawn. The atoll burned, but its runways held. American fighters clawed into the air, outnumbered yet defiant. Then came the counterattack. From Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, waves of planes arrowed toward the Japanese fleet. The ocean below looked serene, but high above it, death was circling. The first attacks failed. Torpedo squadrons flew low, straight into walls of enemy fire. One by one, their planes burst into flames and vanished into the sea. Of 41 torpedo bombers, only 6 returned. The rest lay scattered across the Pacific. Brave men lost in blue silence. But fate, it seemed, had waited for the right moment. As the Japanese carriers turned to dodge the torpedo planes, their decks were cluttered with refueling aircraft and armed bombs. Then, from the clouds above, the dauntless dive bombers appeared, Yorktown's group among them. They fell out of the sky like vengeance. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning from bow to stern. The 4th, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike, desperate to even the score. The sky over Yorktown darkened with incoming aircraft. The alarm sounded. Men ran to stations they already knew by heart. Gunners took aim. Smoke from the Japanese carriers still hung in the air, drifting like ghosts over the water. The first bomb hit near amidships. The ship shuddered, fire racing along the hangar deck. Another struck forward, tearing through armor. The deck heaved. Men were thrown from their feet. For a moment, the whole ship seemed to pause, as if deciding to live or die. Then she steadied. Damage control teams moved with practiced fury. Hoses hissed, pumps roared. Men crawled through heat and smoke to patch ruptured lines. The captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and certain. "We can hold her, boys. Stay with it." They did. Within an hour, the fires were contained. Smoke drifted off into the wind. Yorktown was scarred but alive. The crew believed they had beaten death again. Some even smiled. But the sea was not finished with them. Late that afternoon, another wave of bombers found her. With her radar damaged and her escort scattered, Yorktown stood nearly alone. 2 bombs found their mark. Another torpedo struck her port side. The carrier listed hard. Power failed. Water flooded below decks. The order came to abandon ship. Men slid down ropes into the waiting sea, the water slick with oil and debris. Some swam toward destroyers that circled to rescue them. Others floated among burning wreckage, watching their ship slowly fade in smoke. A young radio man later recalled, "I could see her name still shining on the stern, even through the fire. I thought, maybe she'll make it, maybe she'll find a way." By nightfall, Yorktown was adrift, silent, wounded, but not yet sunk. Her surviving crew were pulled from the water, eyes stinging with salt and grief. They looked back at her silhouette against the horizon, proud and terrible in the fading light. The Battle of Midway raged on around them. American planes struck again and again until Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier, exploded in a fireball that lit the night. The tide had turned. The Imperial Navy would never recover. Midway was victory, bought with courage, sacrifice, and the steel will of ships like Yorktown. But for her, the war was not quite over. She still floated, broken but alive, drifting on a calm sea that no longer cared who had won. Under the stars, she waited, as if unwilling to sink until her duty was done. And somewhere deep within her flooded hull, the echoes of her men lingered, footsteps, laughter, the hum of engines that would never start again. Night came gently after the storm of battle. The Pacific stretched wide and empty, glowing silver under a calm moon. The sea that had swallowed so many now looked serene, as if it had never known war. For the survivors aboard the escort destroyers, it felt strange, this silence after so much fire. They watched their ship, Yorktown, drifting quietly under the stars, her great frame listing slightly, her deck twisted and scarred. She looked wounded, yes, but proud still, a battered giant refusing to bow. The order had been given to abandon her, yet she did not sink. Hours passed. She floated on as if the ocean itself could not bear to let her go. Engineers and officers aboard the destroyer Hamann studied her silhouette and whispered in disbelief. She should have gone down long ago, but she hadn't. It was as though some invisible will was holding her above the waves. By dawn, the horizon was a smear of pale light. Yorktown still stood, broken, blackened, but afloat. Admiral Fletcher, her commander, refused to accept her loss. He ordered a salvage operation. Crews from Hamann and other nearby ships prepared to return to her. They would board, pump out water, patch the holes, and tow her home. It was madness, perhaps, but no one said so. They all felt the same pull. You did not leave family behind. Men climbed the ropes and ladders to her deck. The air smelled of smoke and oil. Metal still radiated heat from fires long extinguished. Everywhere they looked, they saw reminders: scorched helmets, spent shell casings, a shoe half buried in soot, the remains of a plane still strapped to the deck. But there was life too. Seagulls circled, the sea was calm, and in the quiet, the ship creaked softly, like a giant breathing in its sleep. They began the work. Pumps thudded to life. Cables snaked across the decks. Divers sealed holes below the waterline. There was hope again, fragile but real. If they could hold her steady through the night, she might yet be saved. She had survived Coral Sea. She had survived Midway. Why not this too? Then, as the afternoon wore on, a whisper moved through the fleet, a shape on sonar, faint but real, a submarine. At first no one believed it. The ocean was calm, the sky clear, the battle was over. Surely the enemy had retreated. But the ocean has its own plans. Beneath the glittering blue, the Japanese submarine I-168 was gliding silently through the dark, drawn to the crippled carrier like a shark to blood. At 1:30 p.m., the destroyers picked her up on sonar. Depth charges were dropped. The sea boiled, but nothing surfaced. The silence returned, deceptive, deadly. Minutes later, from beneath the waves, 4 torpedoes raced toward the sunlight. The first missed. The second struck Yorktown on her port side. The third and fourth slammed into Hammond, still tied alongside, pumping water from her wounded sister. The explosions tore through her hull, splitting her in two. Men were thrown into the air. The ocean turned white with spray and flame. The Hammond sank in minutes. Her depth charges, still armed, detonated as she went under, sending shock waves through the water. Bodies, oil, and twisted steel filled the sea between the ships. On Yorktown, the deck shuddered. Fires broke out anew. The smell of burning paint and fuel filled the air. Men who had spent days fighting flames now found themselves battling them again, exhausted and stunned. Those still alive on the deck looked to the horizon and saw their salvation vanish beneath the waves. Then they looked down at their own ship, wounded beyond hope, yet still refusing to sink. The order came once more to abandon her. There was no argument this time. Men leapt into lifeboats and oil-slicked water, helping the wounded, counting heads that would never answer back. By sunset, the ocean was again calm. The destroyers circled, gathering survivors. From their decks, men watched Yorktown in silence. Smoke trailed lazily from her wounds. Her flag still fluttered, tattered, but upright. A sailor whispered, "She won't go, not until she's ready." And she didn't. Through the night she floated, quiet, proud, unwilling to yield. Men aboard the nearby destroyers barely slept. Some stared out across the moonlit sea, watching her shadow drift. Others prayed softly, asking that if she must go, she would go gently. At dawn on June 7th, the sea began to claim her. The list grew sharper. The saugered edge sank lower and lower, the waterline climbing across her battered hull. The flag still waved just above the foam. One man later said it was like watching a living thing die. She didn't fight it, she just let go. Slowly, Yorktown rolled onto her side. The ocean filled her hangars, her corridors, her heart. The great carrier slipped beneath the surface bow first, her stern rising high like a final salute. Then, with a sound like a sigh, she was gone. The sea closed over her, leaving only ripples and oil. Silence returned. The men who survived stood along the rails of their rescue ships, hats in hand. No one spoke. The horizon stretched empty before them, as though the ocean had swallowed not just a ship, but a part of their souls. For a long time afterwards, sailors swore they could still see her sometimes, a shadow beneath the waves, a shape rising through the mist at dawn. Others said it was just the light, or memory, or guilt. But those who had fought on her decks, who had heard her heartbeat in the roar of her engines, they knew better. Some ships die and are forgotten. Others live on in stories. But a few, a rare, sacred few, never die at all. They linger not as wrecks, but as presence. Yorktown was one of them. The Ghost of Midway had finally gone home.
Decades passed. The ocean forgot nothing. The war ended. New ships rose. The old was scrapped, rebuilt, renamed. But the Yorktown remained, somewhere in the endless blue, lying silent beneath the waves where sunlight could no longer reach. Her name faded from the lips of the world, but not from the hearts of those who had known her. For them, she was more than steel. She was youth, fear, hope, and the sound of engines in the dark. She was the last voice of boys who had never grown old. Years turned to decades. The men who had once manned her decks grew older, their hair silver, their hands shaking when they spoke of her. They met at reunions in small halls and Navy clubs, raising glasses in her name. They laughed, they cried, and sometimes they fell silent all at once, remembering. "She went down fighting," one of them would say. Another would nod. "She didn't sink, she left." They never stopped wondering where she rested. Somewhere in the Pacific, they knew, the Yorktown still waited, beneath miles of black water and time. Then, in 1998, after 56 years, the ocean gave up its secret. A research team, led by oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who had found the Titanic, set out aboard a vessel named Laney Choust. Their mission? To locate the wreck of the aircraft carrier Yorktown, lost at Midway. They carried sonar, remote-operated submersibles, and something harder to measure, reverence. For days they searched the ocean floor. Nothing but silt and shadows appeared on their screens. The Pacific, vast and silent, guarded her well. But Ballard had read the logs, the last coordinates, the currents, the wind directions of that fateful week in June 1942. He knew she was near. On the third night, as the cameras swept over the abyssal plain, the sea gave a sign. A shape emerged from the dark, enormous, unmistakable. A hull rising out of the mud, tilted slightly to one side, her deck still intact, a ghost frozen in perfect stillness. There she was, the USS Yorktown, CV-5. After 56 years of silence, she had been found. When the first clear image appeared on the monitor, the room went silent. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Then one of the technicians whispered, "She's still standing." And she was. Her island towered above the seabed, draped in marine snow.
Her anti-aircraft guns were still pointed toward the sky, ready for a battle long since over. Her flight deck was torn in places, but her name, Yorktown, was still visible, faint but proud. She rested 16,650 feet below the surface, in water so cold and black that time itself seemed to stop there. Around her lay debris, a wing, a helmet, the skeleton of a plane still strapped to its catapult, waiting for a launch that never came. The cameras drifted through her silent corridors. Doorways opened into rooms where sunlight had never entered. Tables, cups, even bunks were still in place. It looked less like a wreck and more like a ship paused mid-breath. As the lens passed through her empty hangar, something stirred in those watching above. The crew of the expedition, scientists hardened by years of exploration, found themselves wiping tears they didn't expect. Ballard himself said softly, "She looks like she could sail tomorrow." The ocean had not destroyed her. It had preserved her. Every rivet, every beam, every scar was still there, a monument built not by human hands, but by time and pressure and silence. Word spread quickly. When the news reached the surviving crewmen, now old and frail, many wept openly. Some said it was like finding an old friend. Others said it was like visiting a grave they'd never been able to reach. A handful of them were invited to see the footage in person. They sat there she was again, their ship, drifting in eternal peace, her flag still faintly visible on her tower. One veteran whispered, "We came back for you, old girl." Another smiled through tears, and she waited. For those men, it was more than history. It was closure, a circle completed after a half-century. They spoke to her as if she could hear. Maybe she could. The ocean has a way of carrying voices farther than anyone believes. Today, the Yorktown still lies in the dark. No human diver has ever touched her. The Navy decreed she would remain undisturbed, a war grave for the souls that went down with her. Above her the currents drift softly, and sunlight dances far overhead, never reaching her resting place. Yet, in that darkness, she is not alone. Sometimes the cameras that revisit her catch strange glints, reflections that move against the light, shapes that vanish when the lens turns. The crew who operate the remote submersibles often report a strange calm when they descend to her, as if the sea grows quieter, listening. It is said that the ocean keeps what it loves. And so she sleeps, her decks covered in the white lace of coral, her name still etched in memory and steel. Somewhere above, the gulls cry over Midway. The same winds that once carried the smoke of battle now brush across the empty waves. The war has long ended, but its ghosts have not left. They simply wait, quietly, faithfully, beneath the sea that once was their home. And if you were to stand on the cliffs of Midway at dawn, looking east across the endless horizon, you might swear you see her shape in the distance, proud, steady, eternal. The USS Yorktown, the Ghost of Midway, still sails not through water, but through memory. Her engines are gone, her crew long departed, yet something in her remains alive. The courage, the sacrifice, the sound of 1,000 hearts beating together against the impossible. She is no longer just a ship. She is a promise kept, a story that refused to sink. And though the waves roll endlessly over her grave, she will always rise again. In every whisper of the sea, in every flag that catches the wind, and in every sailor who looks out across the horizon and feels that faint, unexplainable pride. Because some ghosts never haunt, they guard, they remember, they endure. Forever beneath the waves, the ghost of Midway.